Thank you for joining us on the next episode of the Sherburne Soil and Water Podcast. Today, we are going to be talking about aquatic invasive species, not only in Sherburne County, but also Minnesota. My name is Miranda Wagner, and I'm the agricultural conservationist with the Sherburne Soil and Water. And I'm going to have Megan and Dan both introduce themselves. Megan, you can go first.
Yeah, I'm Megan Weber, and I'm an aquatic invasive species extension educator at the University of Minnesota.
And what is your background? How long have you been with Extension, and were you anywhere else before that?
Yeah, so I started an extension in 2016, and prior to that, I've been working around aquatic invasive species for around like 15 years, I think. I started out doing monitoring and response planning for a water district out in California. And then I moved on and worked in private industry for a little bit, doing some pesticide development before I came here and started doing more public engagement and education.
How about you, Dan?
Hi, everyone. Dan Cibulka. I'm the Senior Water Resource Specialist with Sherburne Soil and Water Conservation District. And in my role with the district, I oversee our watershed planning efforts, some project management, and then I also spearhead our aquatic invasive species prevention plan for the county.
And so speaking of spearheading our aquatic invasive species program, what do we have coming up in August?
This is an event called Starry Trek. It is created and hosted by the University of Minnesota Extension, so Megan and others. It's been in running for a number of years now, and it's one of the, I would say, the more fun events that we host during the summer. But it is an event to gather people together, train them on what aquatic invasive species are, what do they look like, and how do we monitor these things. And then we send the groups out to different lakes within the county with some sampling equipment that you see on the screen on the left-hand side there to look for these things. And it's I would say one of the most important ways that we monitor for AIS within the county. We have groups of 12 to 15 people each year, it seems, so good turnout. And so that's many eyes out on the water helping us to look for these potential invaders.
And if they want to get involved with Starry Trek, who do they contact?
So they can contact either myself or they can sign up directly on the University of Minnesota Extension's website, and we'll put that information in the resources panel for this podcast. But that event is coming up. It's a Saturday, August 10th, and I hope to see all of you there.
Perfect. Thank you, Dan. So you and I were talking a little bit in the office, and I can say that with the resource concerns that we work with in Sherburne County, I probably know the smallest amount about aquatic invasive species. Zebra mussels are bad, right? And there's aquatic plants that people don't like. So we're coming into the busiest, maybe not the busiest, but one of the busiest boating weekends in Minnesota with July 4th coming up. So in Sherburne County, what are the biggest concerns? What are the most common invasive species that we're seeing in our waters?
Mm-hmm. So in Sherburne County, we do have quite a few lakes that have curly leaf pondweed. Curly leaf pondweed is a plant that starts its growing cycle early in the year and often kind of dies back actually during the month of July. But it is quite prevalent not only in Sherburne County, but throughout the state as well. We also have a few lakes with Eurasian water milfoil. Your curly leaf pondweed and Eurasian water milfoil are plants that grow under the water, so they're submerged plants. And so we do have several lakes with Eurasian water milfoil. Both of these plants can be quite invasive in that they'll grow dense single species colonies, monotypic, we call that colonies. So they crowd out some of our native plants. They grow dense throughout the water column, but also horizontally and then also vertically as well. So at their peak growth, you may see some of those plants surface matting the water. And so that's tough to cast a lure through or to swim or boat through. We also have a few lakes that do have zebra mussels. So we see some of those D-shaped shells for the zebra mussels on the left-hand side of your screen. In fact, one of them is hitching a ride, so to speak, on a native mussel. So we do have a few lakes with zebra mussels. And then we do have a few lakes, and then within the Mississippi River, golden clam, which is an uh, interesting invasive non-native clam that was originally thought to not be able to survive in our climate because we have quite cold winters here and long winters. But we have been seeing some sustained populations of golden clam in several areas in the county.
So Megan, how does this compare to the rest of the state?
Yeah, I'd say, curly-leaf pondweed, Eurasian water milfoil, zebra mussels are probably some of our most prevalent aquatic invasive species across Minnesota. But also, there's some regional things to think about too, like spiny water flea is something of concern in particular in the northeastern part of the state, and common carp, maybe more in the southern half-ish of the state. But also thinking about some of the species that are either fairly new to Minnesota or aren't here yet are some of the things that we try to think about. So, for example, starry stonewort, which is, the star of the show when it comes to starry trek, is relatively new to Minnesota, first found here in 2015. And still a species that we think about a lot for early detection. That's why we have events like Starry Trek for it. And then also some species that maybe aren't here yet, like hydrilla or European frogbit are ones that we think about that we'd really like to have our eyes out for in case someone were to discover it here.
And so Dan touched on this a little bit, but why do we care? Why do we care about invasive species? Um, I mean, can they impact recreation? Do they impact native species? Like, it's all of that, right? Where do you see the greatest impacts?
Yeah, I would agree. All of that. And it depends on which species it is as to what its greatest impact might be. But in terms of recreation, maybe some of the most visible ways would be, as Dan had mentioned, aquatic plants that can kind of create these monotypic stands or like have a lot of surface matting that happens. And it just kind of, it gets in the way of our boats or us wanting to be able to swim through those areas, or things like zebra mussels where maybe I don't want to swim in the lake anymore with bare feet, and now it's better that I wear water shoes so that I don't get cuts from the zebra mussels. We can see impacts to some of our favorite fishing species that we might target when we're fishing. So for example, there's been research from the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center that's shown that there's impacts to young of the year walleye in terms of their size in lakes that are invaded with zebra mussels and also spiny water flea. And then maybe to top that off, that like it gets even worse if they're both in the lake. So it's another point that just because you have one aquatic invasive species doesn't mean that prevention should stop. There's other things that you perhaps still would like to avoid getting into your favorite lake.
So we have kind of brought up Story Trek, but there are other opportunities, and we're more familiar with what's happening in Sherburne County. But Dan, can you talk about what the general public, what lake groups can do to help prevent and stop more invasive species coming, or to get a good tab on current populations?
Yeah, we host a number of different monitoring activities, volunteer-based monitoring activities in the county, and so we have done things like Starry Trek where you use those rope rake samplers, and so that's probably the best way to get involved. We do have a number of residents who live on lakes that have zebra mussel settling plates. So these are plates that you lower from your dock that provides a hard surface for zebra mussels to latch onto. And so we do have a number of residents that have those and are checking them throughout the summer. That's a good way of determining early on if there's an invasion from zebra mussels. Other approaches, we might use fine mesh nets, like you see the gentleman on the left on the image there, looking for zebra mussel villagers. Those are the tiny larvae or offspring that come into the water during the midsummer time period. And then I guess I would just ask, or I would offer that people can just become familiar with these things. So keeping up on your identification What does Eurasian water milfoil look like? How does it differ from some of our native species? There are 8 species of native milfoils in this region, so to tell one from the other takes a little bit of hands-on practice. And then otherwise, I would turn it over to Megan, because there are some great programs that MASERC and the University of Minnesota Extension offers for people to become more familiar with AIS.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Alongside Starry Track, we've been working on a relatively new project that we call Spiny Surveillance. It was developed by MASERC researchers, and the focus is on spiny water fleas. So, that northeastern part of the state I mentioned was an area that we see spiny water flea the most. Um, and there's a lot of interest in seeing, if there's other lakes. It's maybe one that's a little bit more difficult to detect early on. So having, the right equipment and some focused searches might help improve with that. So there's interest not only in that northeastern part of the state, but also in other parts. Closest to Sherburne County would probably be Lake Mille Lacs, has spiny water flea in it. Um, so there's that one. We also have ways for folks who live in lakes that already have zebra mussels to help contribute to research there as well. That's a project that's continuing on in its pilot phase. We call it Zebra Mussel Safari, and both Big and Mitchell Lakes in Sherburne counties have been a part of that pilot since we started it. And then we also have lots of classes for people who just want to, learn more about what's going on, or how to manage aquatic invasive species, or what's happening with the research, or if they're interested in volunteering more generally. We have lots of programs like that within our program as well.
So on the title page for this podcast, we'll have contact information for both Megan and Dan in case one of these programs seems interesting to you, something that you want to be involved with. They would be the best contact to figure out how you kind of can fit into that puzzle. So we keep talking about the acronym MASERC. We love acronyms with the government. So can you clarify what MASERC is and what they do?
Yeah, so MASERC is short for the Minnesota Aquatic Invasive Species Research Center. And that was created in 2012. And it's an interdisciplinary research center housed at the University of Minnesota. And it's dedicated to addressing the effects of aquatic invasive species in Minnesota waters through innovative research and strategic partnerships, like ones with Sherburne Soil and Water Conservation District, as well as public engagement. And it was started out by your lottery dollars at work. It's funded through the Minnesota Environment and Natural Resources Trust Fund, as recommended by the Legislative Citizen Commission on Minnesota Resources. Each of those have acronyms too, if you if you want them to go with it. But yeah, it's a really unique center, and we're really lucky to have something like that in Minnesota, because they do a lot of great work focusing on research-driven solutions to aquatic invasive species problems. There's a lot of collaboration and partnerships. They do a lot of interdisciplinary work, so it's not necessarily just, like the biology of invasive species, but we get into, issues of economics and public engagement. But then also that public engagement side is a piece that they've really focused on. And I'm kind of biased because that's what led to, the creation of my job. But MASERC partnered with University of Minnesota Extension to help create these extension programs that are focused on aquatic invasive species, and, getting more information out to the general public as well around it.
And what are we doing, Dan, in conjunction with MASERC in Sherburne County?
Quite a bit, actually. MASERC, I think Megan summed it up well. It's a very unique and very incredible tool, program, et cetera, for our state. Myself, as a local implementer, somebody who's looking on a county basis to manage aquatic invasive species, so I'm able to turn to MASERC for guidance on monitoring protocols. What's the best equipment to use? When's the best time to go out there to look for aquatic invasive species? And now we have aquatic invasive species. What are the alternatives? What are the options for management or continued monitoring? And so MASERC really pulls together experts in this field to provide those kind of management resources for people locally. So somebody like myself, but also the people that work on AIS within Sherburne County on a voluntary basis. So that there's training programs. You can become an AIS detector, where you learn to identify these things and how to monitor for them. And then you can give back to your community by going out and monitoring these lakes and making sure that they are free of AIS. So they really produce a tremendous amount of tools and research that have very hands-on applicability for us at the local level to help us address this issue.
So, are these efforts working in Sherburne County and statewide on detecting new AIS, um, stopping the spread? We have Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers. We have all of these campaigns that are happening. I'm sure everyone has seen a Clean Drain Dry billboard up in the state of Minnesota. Is there any research backing that these are these approaches are working? Who wants to take that? Megan, I'll let you take that one.
Yeah, so certainly there's some great information around the lines of early detection. It's maybe the easier thing to, study and document is when you find something compared to proving that, you didn't find something or that something didn't come and it would have otherwise. That's maybe a more difficult research question to answer. But especially, I think going back to Starry Trek, since we kind of started there, when we first launched this program in 2017, volunteers who were participating in that found starry stonewort in a Stearns County lake that was Grand Lake. And it was a really small population at the time. So it was a really great early detection story. And the great part about that too was that it led to some early management and it makes the management much more likely to be successful. And also probably more affordable when you can do it on a much smaller scale like that. So Grand Lake has been a really good success story in terms of early detection and why it's really important to kind of keep those efforts. On the prevention side, I think we do have some good data that, like, people in general want to do the right thing, and that people are learning and have an idea of what they're supposed to be doing. We of course can also identify areas that we can improve the work that we're doing in the areas of prevention outreach. But yeah, it's a tricky thing to measure, you know, infestations that would have happened if it
Mhm.
weren't for that, and how that's a much trickier question to answer for sure.
Well, Dan, do you want to tell the story about how golden clam was discovered in Sherburne County? It's really neat.
That is a great story. Yeah, and I would agree with Megan too. It's a difficult thing to measure. As I tell all the volunteers when we head out each year for Starry Trek, the goal of this event is to go out and not find anything. Let's all go out and have an uneventful day. That's that's the goal. And so that's maybe not very exciting, but that's what success looks like in this game often. But it was a few years ago that we had our annual Starry Trek event, and so folks arrived at Big Lake Township Park in the morning. We had some specimens to look through to get kind of keyed in with our identification skills. We went through the protocol of how do you use a rope rake to monitor for AIS, and then the groups dispersed. And each group had a few different lakes that they looked at. And so there was a family of 4 that went up to the Briggs Chain Lakes. And so they went to the public access and they went through their procedures. And a young gentleman who was 12 years old, I believe at the time, pulled up a mass of plants, and then he found 2 little clams that he said, I don't think these belong here. And he brought them back to me, and I looked at them and I said, I don't think those belong there either. And I was just absolutely floored. I was shocked to see, like, it wasn't on our radar. We weren't looking for that per se, because we didn't think that, again, these clams would survive in a lake that they have a cold tolerance. And we believed at the time that perhaps the cold weather that we have and months of ice cover in Minnesota would not be suitable for these clams. And so Megan and I, for the next year, we scratched our heads and we monitored these clams we through the ice and then during the open water season. And we were able to establish that there was at least several breeding cycles for these clams, and so they had indeed survived at least a couple years. Now, the following year, we did have a very cold year, exceptionally cold, and we did not find any surviving clams after that time period. So it is possible that they're able to survive some years, but not others. But that was just a really great story of a family having fun at an event, a young man who's really interested in science, who went out there and found something that we weren't even looking for, and it really put Sherburne County on the map. And it I think it really caused a lot of us that do AIS management to scratch our heads and think about how does an eventual shifting climate impact these species? Are they able to inhabit areas that they were not able to previously because we have on average 14 fewer days of ice cover in Minnesota compared to years ago? So it's really something to take into consideration with extreme events and then changing events over time. How do these invasive species play into that?
I think that story is a good reminder of how the general public can be involved and how we sometimes feel really overwhelmed by a big problem like AIS and what can we actually do as citizens. We can do a lot. And MASERC has so many tools and ideas of how as lake users and even if you're not a property owner on a lake, if you're moving your boat or uh, your kayak, whatever it is from lake to lake, things that you can do to make sure that you're not increasing the amount of aquatic invasive species, not just in Sherburne County, but in statewide. So I would love to thank you both for taking time today to talk about aquatic invasive species. And any closing thoughts on Sherburne County, on where we're seeing the state going with aquatic invasive? We didn't even talk about carp. And I feel like that's like the flashy thing we could talk about.
You're right. We didn't talk about carp. That may have its own podcast because there's a lot of really cool things happening with MASERC, and we have implemented some of those things locally here and look to ramp that up here soon. But that is definitely an area of interest in terms of addressing an invasive fish that is impacting fish communities, plant communities within a lake, but there's a water quality benefit to that as well. So that's fun. We may follow up on that later on. That would be a fun podcast. But otherwise, I would say just in closing that Sherburne County, I think is pretty unique in terms of the commitment we have from elected officials, the commitment we have from volunteers, lake residents and non-residents that are really committed to looking to keep the resources that we have free from invasive species. And we do have very concerning plants such as starry stonewort that has been found in a number of lakes adjacent to us. So that is high on our priority list, is to keep our lakes free from starry stonewort, but it is just around the corner, so to speak. So I think if you're interested in aquatic invasive species, look at some of these resources that we'll have on our podcast page. Biggest thing I think is the general public. If you have a boat, a kayak, a canoe, jet ski, any kind of thing that goes in and out of the water, just remember clean, drain, dry. Clean it off, remove all of the plants, any organic matter or mud or silt or anything like that. Drain your boat out, pull that plug when you leave from one lake and go to another, and dry it out. If you dry all of your equipment, then that results in a less hospitable environment to transport something like a zebra mussel, villager, which are very, very small. You may not see them, or any plant material. So I would say that's the biggest thing to remember. Clean, drain, and dry.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, and I would just add, I think, so we do every spring, we do this round of workshops for our AIS detectors core course, where we're certifying a new crop of volunteers and professionals who are kind of looking to make a difference. And at the end of each workshop, we have people answer a question that turns into this word cloud about how you feel about the future of aquatic invasive species in Minnesota. And while there's always, words that kind of end up on both the positive and negative side of, maybe the emotional scale, the biggest word in the middle that gets entered the most is always hopeful. And I love seeing that. I think that's one of the most important things is, it can feel like a really depressing topic at times, but I think that we have a lot to be hopeful for and about, especially with, like solutions that come around the corner. And, we get better and better each year at figuring out, how to manage, how to prevent, how to educate, each of those things. So I think ending on a note of hope is a good way to end.
Thank you. And remember, with the 4th of July weekend coming up, you can clean, drain, dry, just like Dan mentioned, and we can enjoy the water safely for both ourselves and for the future and health of our Sherburne County lakes. Have a good day.